All right, so after a healthy review, we're going into Zion, and we're going to say like this: in order to understand this level of chesed, which is beyond wealth, so to speak, giving to the wealthy, which is also a quality of chesed. He starts off by explaining the concept of wealth as it was in the days of King Solomon, the wealthiest man, arguably, that ever lived. Darga hachi nailis bashir, not arguably. It is the highest level of wealth that ever existed on earth, right? Umivar dezesh shebiyimei Shlomo hu kaima sihar ba'ashlamusa. We explain, oftentimes we use this language from the Zohar, that in the days of Shlomo, the moon was standing in its fullness. Why do we say that there was a full moon in the days of Shlomo? Who knows the secret here?
Is it because Malchus was in full swing?
Yeah, but why? What's like the proof that Malchus was in full swing?
The Jewish people were the...
What made it at that time? A full moon doesn't get there by itself, right? It has to first be like a half moon, before that a quarter moon. So what made suddenly the generation of Shlomo be the full moon of the Jewish people? From Avram Avinu until Shlomo HaMelech was 15 generations. 15 generations, like the 15 climbing levels of the moon until it gets full, right? So it wasn't like, so to speak, accidental. The Jewish people reached their peak spiritually and physically. We had the Beis HaMikdash, we had all the wealth in the world, and quite literally we were the rulers of the entire earth. Every single nation on earth would bring, money and service to King Solomon. He was advising every single person on the planet about how to run their country. It was like mamish messianic, and there was no war on earth for 40 years, the only time in history. Right? So this is called Kaima Sihara Ba'ashlamusa, that the moon was standing in its fullness in the days of Shlomo. So he says that in these days, Hu denosef lezeshenimshachu malchus levana sihara hey partsufim shenechseru. So what was going on spiritually Kabbalistically at that time, in addition to the fact that it was drawn into Malchus, as you mentioned, it was the fullness of the Jewish people, are also called Malchus, right? It was drawn into Malchus, which is representative of the moon, the Sihara, you say in Aramaic, the 5 partsufim that were lacking. So in addition to the 5 partsufim that were lacking, in other words, Malchus and Za and Abba and Ima and Keser, they were all flowing beautifully, and the world lacked nothing. In addition to that, literally the world lacked nothing spiritually and physically, because all that it had when it was in its original source was actually flowing into it after creation, after 15 generations from Abraham. Besides that, nimshach bagam gilu de penimius keser atik. It was also flowing into it something from penimius of the keser, which is atik, which we're calling ashirus, right? Mashirus to Malchus, Knesset Yisrael, Nimshachas Ashirus Muflagal Yisrael Gam Lamata. And from the richness that was flowing into this higher version of Malchus, the sphere of Malchus of Atzilus was receiving not only from Arich Anpin, but also from Atik Yomin. So there was an abundance of light from beyond creation flowing into Malchus of Atzilus, and therefore also down below, the reflection of that is that the Jewish people were just ridiculously wealthy because we were getting a type of was not to begin with relevant to the world. A level of wealth which was something beyond what it was even in the source of the potentiality of the world before it was created.
It was glib.
No, it was not glib. It was atik, not panemius of atik.
Oh.
Right? It was wealth, not giving to the wealthy. Right?
Oh, because the giving isn't in the panemius.
What?
The giving to the wealthy is in of the panemius level.
There's 2 levels of panemius. There's the panemius of Keser, which is Atik, and then we didn't talk about it much yet, but then there's the panemius of Atik.
Right.
Then we didn't get to that yet. In Shlomo's day, just Atik, right? Which means wealth, abundance of wealth of a level from beyond creation, and it showed up in this world as something unbelievable. The world's literally never seen it before or since. It was 40 years of peace. It says silver was worth nothing in the days of Shlomo, and literally every single piece of wealth that could possibly be eked out of this creation and more was in the hands of the Jewish people. Right? Ashirus muflaga bagashmius. It was an indescribable wealth physically. As it says in the verses in the actual Tanakh, that silver was worth nothing in the days of Shlomo Melech. Coming with like mamash bars of silver, they just say like, get out of here, man. There's no place for you over here. Vashirush muflag beruchnias. Therefore, that led also, or one the other way around, it was an unbelievable spiritual wealth that in the days of Shlomo, Dafken Nivnas Beis HaMikdash, that's when the temple was first built, the final resting place of Hashem in Yerushalayim, like the promised land, Beis HaBechira, that's when it came into the existence. Before that, in the entire creation, up until that point, it did not exist such spiritual potentiality. The Gilu Shava Beis HaMikdash, who Gilu Naila Yoser, Megilu Shava Mishkan. Because the revelation in the Beis HaMikdash was a higher level of revelation than was in the Mishkan, which we had earlier. So we already had the Mishkan from the days of Moshe, the Mishkan being the portable temple of Hashem. So we had all the sacrifices and the implements, and like it was happening, but it was only in a temporary version. It was on the move, right? Only when it came to its final resting place was the ultimate power of the temple released. All that in the days of Shlomo. Probably a really interesting time to be alive.
We're saying it was being drawn from the Keter.
Panemius HaKeser.
The Pinimi,
Atik.
which is the lower
Atik.
Keter. Yeah.
No, it's not the lower Keter, it's the higher part of Keser.
Okay.
But even that, there's something higher than it, which we didn't discuss yet.
Again,
there's 3 levels. In Keser, there's 3 levels. Arich, Atik, and which we didn't discuss too much yet, Panemius of Atik.
Okay. And right now it's being drawn from Atik. The Pneumius of Atik. No.
Atik.
Just Atik.
We're talking about Shlomo's days. Not only were the 5 partsufim that were missing filled in, tzedakah, there was even something from above that, from Atik, which is wealth, and that's why everybody was so wealthy.
So that was a shirus.
That's a shirus. Okay. That's the level of a shirus, which is drawing from Atik, which is from a level in godliness which preceded the world entirely.
Yeah.
Lahosif, to add, we're about to turn the page. Dezesh b'yemei Shlomo hayagilu naila b'yoser. This, that in the days of Shlomo, there was such a high level revelation. Hu gam lifnei shenivna Beis HaMikdash. It actually was taking place even before he built the Beis HaMikdash. Right, just in the days of Shlomo, they hit the 15th generation, and even before they built the Mikdash, there was still a higher level. Shorizesh shebinyan Beis HaMikdash haya ayat al yedei Shlomo dafka. And it goes the other way. Because the reason why it was specifically Shlomo who built the Beis HaMikdash, David, even though the plans for the Mikdash were already put in place by David in the 14th generation. By the way, today's the 15th of the month. Mm-hmm. So we're right on there. It's a rich day. So even though the plans were put in place by David HaMelech, why did he not build it? David HaMelech conquered the whole Eretz Israel, had all the power, had the plans, had the money. Why didn't he do it? Because we didn't hit the 15th yet. It wasn't like ripe to receive from the fullness of the moon in this way, right? So even when before the Shlomo actually built the Beis HaMikdash, it was the light was already there, and therefore it was for sure him that would build it, right? Because he had that spiritual richness. And this is what it says: Who Shlomo. Manucha v'shalom v'sheket eten al Yisrael b'yamav. And that's why was his name Shlomo? Because Shlomo means he was a man of peace, and there was shalom and sheket, there was peace and quiet. Literally, Hashem gave to the Jewish people in his days. And therefore, lechein hu yivne bayis lishmi. That's why he was going to be the one to build the house. Because he already contained this level of peace. He already contained this level of total tranquility, that there was something beyond the world. It's known that all the nations were nullified to King Solomon. And that's what, of course, made there be peace and rest in his days, that all the nations were nullified to him. We didn't have any enemies. Why were they? What do they love so much about Shlomo? They didn't even realize it. But what they were really buttled to was the revelation of the Orein Sof that was coming out of him. So in other words, when an entity that is a created being comes before a level of reality which precedes the worlds, it's like they can't find their hands and feet. They don't have anything to say. They can't fight with that. There's no there's no handle that they can find to sort of find themselves in their own private interest and therefore their own opposition in place and in front of such a light which is completely beyond creation. So it nullifies, finite, in other words, is nullified before infinite. And therefore, since through Shlomo, this 15th level, the full moon was just flowing out infinity, therefore, of course, there was going to be peace in his days because the Goyim can't really fight or even find any opposition against such a thing.
So at that point in history, it's not like the rest of history where like the Goyim are like, hey,
Right.
hey, be a good Jew.
Right.
Hey, bring the Beis Hamikdash. Like
Right.
everything was set in place.
Yeah, because
they weren't bothering us at all whatsoever.
Right. In general, when we call zeh l'umat zeh, which is the language in Hasidus used for the other side. It means one side opposes the other side, right? In general, the only way that that's possible, that one side can oppose the other side, is if the side of Kedusha is limited. Because once there's a limitation, you can identify those limitations, and then you can oppose them. Like my love is it's a finite level of love. I daven, and I'm excited about God, and I feel like an interest, and love comes out of me. Because it's a limited love, my love for hamburgers and milkshakes, not together, of course, that's a whole different thing, will all of a sudden grab on to my love of God, because once the love experience is there, there's other things that you could love. There's an alternative. Because my divine experience is of a finite nature, it has an edge. And at the edge of that finite nature, it could leave room for foreign loves. So therefore, when the Jewish people are experiencing something which is worldly, a worldly divine light, which is by definition finite, there's opposition from the world, because they also want to take like that energy and bring it into a different direction. They can oppose such a thing. When the love is infinite, my love goes on forever for Hashem. So if literally forever, beyond finite limitations, because we're talking about Ashirus, wealth, which is something beyond the limitations of the world. So there's no handle. That's what I meant before. There's no like end and edge where it could leak out into a foreign love. So when Shlomo's sitting there holding on to the Or Ein Sof, and the love of Hashem is just dominating infinitely, nobody can oppose it, right? Because it doesn't have like an edge where it says up until here is the edge of Kedusha. From there on, maybe we can fight with you and poke you around. They couldn't find a way to poke through the holes and like stop the ever-flowing love of God. So they were just nullified to him. They just basically did what he wanted. That's the idea. Okay, so why were they nullified? Because of the Or Ein Sof that was flowing through him. And that's a similar reason why we find in the Tanakh the stories that they all came to him to hear his wisdom. Right? Queen Sheba came from Africa. She heard, right? She had her own empire. And she just heard of the brilliant wisdom of this man. It was really the Or Ein Sof that she was like drawn to. And so it expressed itself as, I got to go see this guy and hear his wisdom. The real reason why she wanted his wisdom is not because it was just smarter than everybody else. The real reason they came to him, they were drawn to the godliness. Right? Infinity has a way of absorbing anything finite. Like we say, for example, about a torch. There's a very common mashal that's given in Hasidus. If you have a big giant fire, a torch, if you bring a candle close to it, the candle flame will jump off the wick and it'll join the torch. So this is what we're saying in terms of the godly spark that's found inside of every single created being, right? If you don't bring a big enough fire, then you don't have the power to draw other people's sparks to you. But if your fire is this burning torch, then anyone who comes near it, they're naturally, intrinsically, for some reason they can't explain, drawn to your fire. And that's why all these people were coming to Shlomo. The godliness which was inherent inside of them and everything, it basically was it was experiencing this torch, and it just wanted to jump in. So they weren't really there to go for his wisdom and to get his advice. That was sort of like an external reality of what's going on spiritually. The godliness inherent in them was just drawn to this infinite light source. Yes. This is what it also says regarding Mashiach. Shlomo was almost Mashiach, right? By Mashiach it says, V'naru elav kol hagoyim, that they flowed to him like a river, all the nations. Everyone's going to flow in. Why are everyone going to be drawn to Mashiach? They're not drawn to his smarts. They're drawn to his conduit of a level of divine light, which is Or Ein Sof, that creation can't help but to just like get swallowed up inside of it. So they all flow to him. Ki Agiloi. It just reminds me of National Education Day in the U.S. Right? They made the Rebbe's birthday, Yud Aleph Nisan, is every year. It's a different day on the calendar of the Goyim. But they like whatever it is in the Jewish calendar, and they printed, they minted coins with the Rebbe's picture on it, and they said this is National Education Day, and basically there's this whole thing that came out where they're in New York. They're giving the yeshivas a very hard time, pushing them for this agenda of secularism and all these crazy theories that they're flying around now. And this rabbi of Crown Heights got up and he says, you already acknowledged that the Rebbe is the leader of education in this country. You literally made a day in the calendar, which is Education Day, and it's got our Rebbe's face on it. And you're going to tell us how to educate? It's a great story. Anyway, so they flow to him, all the goyim, ki agiloi or she'eir az, because the level of light that's shown at that time, mashach elav es anitzotzosh sheba'amim, it drew to him the sparks of godliness in those nations. B'dugmas, here's the example I gave, avuka shemosheches eleha kol anitzotzosh, just like a torch that all the little flames and all the little sparks will be drawn into it naturally, if they can't help it. Since the revelation that's shown at that time, there was such a high revelation, again, atik, which is beyond creation. Therefore, even the sparks in very, very distant places, they all were drawn to Shlomo in his days. In other words, David HaMelech was the 14th level, and maybe you could say he fulfilled the union of tzedakah for the world. He drew down the 5 levels. He didn't say that here, but let's just say he was able to bring Arich Anpin into the world, right? So in other words, the world was not lacking anything, and the Jewish people finally had their land. We even had the plans of the Beis Hamikdash. He was not able to bring people from all crazy parts of the world who never heard of us to be drawn to us, because it wasn't the level of infinite light, which is beyond creation. That level, when it came in, true infinity, every little piece of finite creation, no matter where it was found, even from the most distant places, was drawn to it. And that was the real reason what was going on in that generation. As it says, Malchus Shaba, Shama says Shema Shlomo, that Queen Sheba, who was officially very far away, with her own little empire going, she heard about Shlomo, and it says she heard about Shlomo, the Shem Hashem. Really what she heard about was the name of God. And that's why she came to Jerusalem. Okay, that's chapter 7. Everybody following along? Yonasan, you with us? Yonatan, you with us?
Yes.
You're here. Hineni. Okay, Ches.
Hold me.
Ches. Here we go. We're taking some turns here. Strap on your belts. This that Shlomo was called a man of peace. Where we're saying that the refinement of the world that took place in his days was in a way of peace. What does it mean that he refined the world in a way of peace? Unlike David, let's say, who was a man of war, that's why he couldn't build the Beis Hamikdash, because he had blood on his hands. Shlomo was a man of peace, and he refined the world in a peaceful way. What does that mean? Shelo haya tzarich lemilchama. He didn't need to go fight with the world bichdei levaris anitzotzos in order to get the sparks to come out. Oftentimes you do. In other words, there's godliness in everything, but not every enemy is willing to cough up their sparks, right? So sometimes you got to go and capture them. The whole idea of Jewish people conquering lands and taking their spoils is not because we're mean and murderous. It's really, spiritually speaking, the real reason why Hashem commands us to, so to speak, broaden our boundaries and take lands in times when it's permissible is because there's godliness inherent in the world and it's not spitting itself out to us, and therefore you have to go take it, right? Like it says, for example, it's kind of a little bit controversial statement, but that's not foreign to us, is like when it comes to interest, right? It says it's prohibited, of course, to take interest from a Jew, but it's a mitzvah to take interest from a goy. Did you know that? Mm-hmm. If you lend money to a goy and you don't take interest, you're chayev, right? Because first of all, it's not so mean, right? Why does the whole world work with interest? There's no one would think not to take interest because you're actually losing something when you give your money to someone. Big time. Your money sitting in a bank is going to make you money. So I'm going to lend it to somebody. It's not going to make my money. It's a loss, right? The fact that Jews don't take interest is a huge chesed that Hashem put upon us. And even then, in today's time, there's all ways that people try and get around this halachically because it's such a loss. But for a goy, you're not allowed to have that loss. Why? Because the money in the hands of the goy is not been laundered into Jewish hands, which means it has to be used for Shabbos and used for Yom Tov and used for Tefillin and used to raise Jewish kids and give them Jewish Torah education. So as long as the money's over there, you got to take it, right? And especially when it's a reasonable thing to do, and the world even says you should take it, it's a negative mitzvah. You have to take it, or it's the opposite of a positive mitzvah rather. And so the idea is what's going on there. It's like a war. They've got godly sparks. You need to elevate them. The Torah gives you the entree to show you how to do so. So it's not a problem to refine the world by way of war. In a sense, if the world won't be refined by way of peace, you have to refine it by way of war, right? Someone's sitting in our lands and they're sitting there fighting with us and giving us a hard time. No, you don't just sit there and say, let's be peaceful. You conquer them. They're in your land, right? Just like you would throw like a bad guy out of your house. And that's not called a sin. It's actually a mitzvah. There's something called milchamas mitzvah. There's mitzvah wars because the sparks of godliness are not revealed. And therefore we have to go make them be revealed. So this is not a crazy thing to do. It's just that Shlomo beat the system. Because he had found a way to refine the sparks in the world without having to go take them. They brought their sparks to him because he brought such a light which enamored them. They started just giving us all their money and all their lands.
That's because the 5 partsufim were revealed.
No, it's because above the 5 partsufim were revealed. The 5 partsufim is just tzedakah. It's what the world lacked. Okay. He gave wealth, right? He gave from the atik. So in other words, why was he called a man of peace? For this reason. He didn't need to fight with the world in order to get the sparks. Those sparks came running to him so they would be refined. They wanted to be godly. Therefore, but this really was through the revelation that came through the Beis HaMikdash. So in other words, he had the ability to build the Beis HaMikdash because of his intrinsic light, but only when he actually built it did all the sparks come running. The refinement process that took place through the Mishkan, which was the temple before it got to its final resting place, including the revelation that shined in the Aron in the Mishkan, was the Holy of Holies of the Mishkan, right? So this was in a way of war. When the Mishkan was what we had at our disposal to refine the world, it refined the world specifically in a warlike manner. Where do we see that? The Mishkan refined the world in a warlike manner.
When we were traveling through the desert and we were battling all the other nations, or they were trying to take us on sometimes.
All right, we had a few fights in the desert, but mostly what we were fighting in the desert was, believe it or not, the desert. Okay. The desert was filled with snakes and scorpions. And wherever we went, it turned into an oasis of godliness, blooming flowers and streaming rivers, literally, miraculously. And so the idea is that the desert represents the epitome of klippa in the world, right? What is kedusha? Is where things grow. So the desert where no man can live. Who's man? Man is a metaphor for the higher man, which is godliness. So in the desert, no man can live. Godliness was unwelcome in the desert, right? The sparks that were there were so concealed that God could not dwell there. So comes the Mishkan, and it's just plowing through on 42 journeys, just conquering the desert, breaking up these klippas, killing the snakes and scorpions, literally, and turning that place into a place that could hold man. Literally, the Ark of the Covenant, which held the higher man. And we made it by force a place where godliness could dwell. So the whole Mishkan business, and even after the Mishkan was out of the desert, and we brought the Mishkan into Eretz Yisrael, there was a few hundred years there when we didn't have the temple yet, and we were carrying the Mishkan with us in the Holy Land. We built little walls for it, so it was not exactly the same as it was in the desert, but it was also, we were at war with the people in our land. for all that time. Until David HaMelech, we sort of squashed out all the war. He created a Eretz Yisrael, which was now defendable borders and at peace. Now Shlomo could create a whole other way of refining the world. There didn't need to be a refinement by way of war. But up to the whole period of the Mishkan, including when the Mishkan came into Eretz Yisrael, it was a refinement process by going out and defeating the enemies, dealing with them and defeating them. But refining the world once the Mishkan became the Mikdash happened in a completely different way. It was now refining the world by way of peace. No need to fight with the bad guys to get the godliness to come out. On the contrary, they were spitting it out and running towards us, flowing like a river. I do want to point out that we're talking about Chasidecha, right? And why is he saying this? Because this is the Yutes Kislev for bringing. And he's trying to explain what Chasidus is. Why is Chasidus called Chasidus? Because it is the Chesed that we're speaking of. And the Torah of Chasidus is this level of unbelievable way, right? It's called Torah Shalom. It's the Torah of peace. Because when you, not only with the goyim outside of you, but with the goyim inside of you. Hagoy asher bakir b'cha. It says the goy that's in your midst. So we learned that Hasidically to mean that there's a goy inside of every single one of us, maybe many goyim, right? You got the Kanani and the Yavusi and you got all the goyim inside of you. There are all these klippas who are trying to get a hold of your love of God and bring it into your hamburgers, right? So if you're going to bring a limited level of love, they're going to be constantly fighting with you. And if you're going to overcome them, it's because you're going to overcome them in battle. But if you bring an infinite level of love, which comes from Chasidus, then you make your whole experience with yourself much different. Because now they really don't have a handle on you. You're like bringing infinite light, and not only do they not want to fight with you, they sort of bow down and say, use me, King Solomon, use me. I want to be part of your holy business. So this is what he's really explaining, and he's doing it live by teaching us a mimer of Chasidus. This is the way, this is like the futuristic way to refine the world and to refine ourselves. We don't want to fight, right? We don't need to fight. Okay. Anyway, that's a little commercial break for Chasidus. So
sponsored by Chasidus.
Ked'isa b'Zohar, the Zohar states, right? And this is going to take us into a whole nother wonderful idea. It says, Train inun havu da'amnu kuma Hashem. There were two people that stood up in the world and said, rise, O God. Moshe and David. Moshe and David, they both said, Kuma Hashem, literally those words. Moshe Amar, where do we see Moshe Amar, Kuma Hashem? You guys probably know this one. Kuma Hashem, vayafutzu oivecha. Whenever the ark is open, right? Whenever the ark would travel. Or open. We say what Moshe said, rise, O God, and scatter your enemies. Your enemies. Right? This is what we're really saying when we open the ark. Rise, O God, and scatter your enemies. David Amar, Kuma Hashem limnuchasecha. David said, rise, O Hashem, to your resting place. Because David was bringing Hashem home to Jerusalem. Right? Again, the Rebbe Rashab explains in his mimer, this, that the Mishkan and the Holy Ark inside of it were going through the desert. In order to nullify all the negative forces, the klippas that were in the desert, which were what? The nechashim, srafim, v'akravim, snakes and scorpions and other kinds of snakes. And they were going to elevate the holy sparks that had fallen from the world of Tohu. We spoke about it another time, that these powerful levels of God had fallen out of their source and become very formidable opponents of God, because they went through so many levels of contraction that they were now fierce opponents of divinity, right? They would like mamash, the snake, right? The snake is like a symbol for the opposite of Kedusha. And this desert wasn't just like a desert, it was the source on earth where the most powerful and potent levels of evil had somehow collected. And so the Jewish people were going in there to uplift and return the godliness that had fallen into concealment there and raise it up to Hashem. So as we were walking through the desert with this in purpose, hu birur b'derech milchama, that's called refine the world by way of war. Kumo melech, just like a king, sheyotzim komo v'holech l'medinat ha'oyev lilachim bo v'lechkosh bo, right? So we chobsho. So like a king, right? There's something called an offensive war, right? And sometimes you have to go take your army and send it to North Korea, right? Send it to China, send it to whatever. It could be a good guy or a bad guy there. But the point is, you're going to the country of the enemy and you're fighting in order to conquer it. So basically, the idea is you're leaving your place and you're going into the place of the enemy. This is something like what we do during davening, you might say. That essentially, when you daven, you're having this crazy wrestling match with your animal soul, right? And the idea is davening is called war, right? Davening is basically our modern day spiritual version of warring with ourselves. So the ideas are coming in. You're dealing with your animal soul, and you're going and basically into the enemy land, and you're conquering it, and you're saying, no, you're not going to think those thoughts, you're going to think my thoughts. And you're essentially gaining the spoils of your animal soul, using its energy and all of its angst, and you're turning it and converting it into Kedusha. So you're going to the land of the enemy, and you are uplifting it, like a king who goes out to war. And therefore Moshe said, regarding the traveling of the Aron into the desert, Vayhi bin Soha Aron, like we say, and it was when the Aron would travel. We happen to say this when we opened the ark, but this is what Moshe actually said every time they traveled. When the ark would travel, Kuma Hashem vayafutzu ovecha, rise up, O Hashem, and scatter your enemies. Which means sheyeshnam oivim shetzrich lilchom behem, which means he's recognizing that there are enemy forces, there are klippas that are concealing and keeping the godliness in imprisonment, that he has to go and war with them. And we're going to end here. By contrast, the refinement of the world that happened in the Beis HaMikdash was done in a way of peace. Shlomo did not go out warring with his enemies. Shlomo had b'makomo, he sat in his throne. And all the sparks came flowing to him by themselves. And that's why David, who sort of gave the verses to set up the scenario, he said, Kuma Hashem limnuchasecha, rise up, O Hashem, to your peace. Because you're not rising up to go to war, you're rising up to a state of peace where all of the enemies will come to you. Okay, we'll hold here for today.
You were saying, Moshe said, scatter your enemies, but David said,